Hi everyone, good day. Just some housekeeping. I just want to check if I'm audible and visible.
Yes, you are audible and visible.
Thank you so much. Hi, I'm Joseph, no preferred pronouns. I'll take POIs via the chat box. Again, POIs via the chat box. I'll do my best to take one, preferably from opening for good diagonal engagement. The internet right now in uni is a bit intermittent, so at any point I chop out, please let me know. I'll assume I'm still visible and audible. Starting my speech in a few seconds, let me get my paper and timer. Starting my speech in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Mr. Speaker, ladies and gentlemen, what we get from the previous speaker's speech is precisely a reason as to why the presupposition of content is so harmful. It's because at best, you give people an illusion of choice, wherein in reality, the state has already decided for them and ultimately assumed that they want to be altruistic and donate their very precious selves and internal organs in the sake of science for this utilitarian metric that they assert upon people. Who is side opposition to tell me what is best for me if I'm dead, or what is best for my family member who passed away and didn't give any explicit detail if they wanted to be an organ donor or not? The dangerous presupposition of consent is precisely the reason as to why we're having this debate to begin with. Consent is such a gray area because in instances where people are alive or consent to it, it's fine. If they're alive and they do not consent to it, they can opt out. But the point in which this debate and heart of contention is, what happens if they're dead but we're unsure? Ladies and gentlemen, that's exactly the problem, and we rather err on the side of caution, err on the side of their legacy, and don't make that decision for them. Before I move on to my responses, here are a few things against the immediate previous speaker we have to deal with coming from closing government. The first is, they asserted how we can just delegate consent before death. That's a non-issue, ladies and gentlemen, because we think that explicit consent happens if they're alive or they don't consent to it. But the point in which we have to make that dangerous assumption assumes that there's no way to be able to get that consent. And even if that family member were a proxy for that particular decision, my partner already told you why it's different from the cases of doing an autopsy or embalming, which is in the interest of the family to be able to move on and understand why that person died, if they were murdered or not. But the point in which they're forced to be altruistic for the state is something outside this debate that we can't assume is going to be a value that all people would want to opt into all of the time. Secondly, we think that they mentioned how, people can just move on, it's fine, I don't remember my great-grandmother's name, etc. We think that not everyone exists in the same plane of emotional sensitivity. Some people move on faster, some people move on slower, some people get offended, some people don't, some have a thicker skin. But we can't make this blanket statement and tell people that, you should move on because the state wants to use your grandmother's cadaver as a flesh closet to be able to get their organs and be able to give it to a tricycle driver or somebody who needs it. We think that's exactly where manipulation and keeping them emotionally hostage happens. When we have this assumption of martyrdom, ladies and gentlemen, we shouldn't and cannot ascribe these alleged utilitarian, altruistic values simply to force people to make a choice. Because what's the harm? The harm is now the stigma that happens to people who want to be able to opt out. We can't make that assumption that everybody wants to opt in. If you do opt in, then people are going to say, that person was a martyr, they're good, they're helpful to the state. But the point in which you don't want to opt out, you now become labeled as selfish, ladies and gentlemen. You now become labeled as an enemy of the state and an enemy of the free people. And that's exactly the problem in the debate, that we don't want to make these grand assumptions posthumously when somebody dies. Which is why this is very parallel, ladies and gentlemen, to digital necromancy. Like what we saw with the uproar that happened with Bruce Lee. So what happened was that they used AI technology in a concert and a commercial to be able to make an AI-generated Bruce Lee in a Johnny Walker commercial. He was drinking alcohol, selling it, and promoting it. That became so controversial because we all know that Bruce Lee didn't drink alcohol, and he may not have consented from beyond the grave or wherever he is to want to opt into that particular thing. And that's why consent is such an important idea in this debate that you actually get from my partner, wherein he extended and talked about the idea of legacy. He talked about how legacy is the driving force of human life and how ultimately this adds value to very people and create the very things that we want. So before I move on to talking about and crystallizing the issue of what are the consequences of the presupposition of consent, and why is this an overriding value as opposed to whatever utilitarian value we get from opposition? Sure, opening up, go ahead.
Judge, the entire gov bench case can only run if the patient does not consent but forgot to say, or they are telepathically forced without asking them directly. Do we judge this debate based on absurdly far-fetched hypotheticals that defend selfishness or realistic metric?
We think that it's honestly moot and value neutral. Because the point in which people consent, then that's fine. But what this whole debate is about is assuming they would want to in cases where they otherwise did not say it. And they can't give you explicit consent because they're dead, right? And that's exactly where the heart of the case line of government side comes from, wherein we tell you that we want to err on the side of caution and assume they didn't want to, because my partner gave you this analysis, which was missing from opening, about the right to bodily autonomy and the impact that you actually get from your legacy, which we think is a driving force of human life and ultimately related to my partner's horizontal extension about the capacity of family members and the bereaved to be able to mourn their dead in a way that they think is applicable to them. The point in which the state and doctors come inside the emergency room and start opening up the body of your dead loved one is exactly where we violate that consent, something you get from opening, but ultimately that becomes impacted from closing, where we talk to you about how that affects legacy, how that affects perception, how that affects the capacity of people to celebrate and cherish the life that person lived, in relation to mourning, ladies and gentlemen, in relation to grieving. The point in which people are used as flesh cossets and vessels of organs solely by the state is precisely where we say, if we're unsure about the line, we rather not draw one at all and not have this dangerous presupposition of consent. So for all of these reasons, if you want to uphold people's capacities to live full lives and for people to be able to understand and respect their own grief, the motion has to be upheld. Thank you very much.